So thank you for being here. Welcome. It's a really special occasion for us who are fans of Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, and the fact that we could gather tonight or today, depending on where you are, on the actual anniversary of her birth, right? So Elizabeth was born on this day in 1926. So 100 years ago. So we take this excuse to come together and talk a little bit about Elizabeth and how we recognize that she laid the foundation and paved the path for what we know today as the death doula or end of life doula movement. And how, in a way, Elizabeth was too busy being and doing and serving to actually sit down and propose a model of what it is to accompany another. But that it has been, I've taken it upon myself to attempt to do this because, we understand, and we'll talk more about this as we go on tonight, that all of what we know about accompanying others in dying and grieving, all that we know about being doulas, it comes from experience more than anything, and that the trainings that we can offer today are thanks to those of us who were there and who observed and who registered and who wanted to share, right? To the point that today we have organizations as amazing as INELDA, and our special guest today is Douglas Simpson, the director of INELDA, the International End of Life Doula Association, which was one of the two first schools of training end of life doulas in North America, but in the world. Yeah. And so let's see. I don't know. Do you want to say a few words, Doug, before I continue?
No, just just welcome everybody here, and I am grateful for the invitation and to be in this space together.
Hmm. I'm very grateful too. So let's see. So there's a couple of things that I want to say before we get started, right? So um, I personally have been on this path of accompaniment since before I realized that I was part of that, but more officially and consciously in the last 11 years. And before that, Jess, who is my partner in crime through everything that we have been able to accomplish in Mexico and Latin America, um, she and I started before this was a thing, before we even knew that there was such a thing as end of life doula, anything. Understanding that death was an integral part of life and wanting to invite others to live with that truth and connect through that which unites us, which is that we're all going to die. And so, in those first things that we started creating in 2016, we did some biennials where we got people together and, connected dreams and death, which is another thing that we're really interested in, which is why Elizabeth is such our patron saint, if we wanted to use this kind of language. Um, is that one of the things that I was inspired to do was to reach out to Ken Ross, Elisabeth Kübler-Ross's son, and this was in 2018. And I said, look, I think we are finally ready to receive the depth and breadth of the contributions that Elizabeth has made to the field of grief and end of life. And he said, I agree, right? So he accepted to come, not because we had a budget to invite him, but because we had the impulse to want to invite him to our second biennial gathering and be our keynote speaker and talk about Elizabeth. So from there is born the Fundación Elisabeth Kübler-Ross México Centro, which is the branch of the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation that is represented here in Mexico, but we collaborate with other branches in Latin America and around the world. And so a relationship with Ken started, right? So Elizabeth's son. And so we spent a lot of time together in different events and creating things and teaching things and all manner of things. And in those years that we have shared so much, there's a lot that I've apparently received from Elisabeth, because he's always saying, Wilka, you sound just like my mother. But on the other hand, his stories complement what I felt that I understood about Elisabeth. Yeah. And so between the observations that Ken has shared and the observations that I had from my sense or from what I've read, by the way, unless you, in case you don't know, Elisabeth wrote more than 26 books. There are 26 books that have been published. She lost like 30 manuscripts that were never published when her house was set on fire by people who hated the people who were helping people with AIDS, Elisabeth being the one. And so, she was super prolific, and she has covered so much territory around death and grief that is worth exploring beyond the most known texts. So in any case, between what I shared with Ken and Ken shared with me, I started to observe certain things that I thought were worthy of kind of being placed on some kind of map to understand what was her approach and how somehow this reflects what we do today. Because one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that she laid a foundation so that we could grow from there. That it's not just about what Elisabeth did and said, but that through us, it continues to evolve into what is relevant for us today, right? So we don't just have the responsibility of learning everything that she was able to show to us from all that she documented, but that we also have the joy and responsibility of evolving that to what is most current, right? And this is also why we have gatherings such as this, where we can all come together and share about our experiences and what we have observed and learned in the spaces of accompanying the dying and the grieving, because that is the most updated curriculum. What is happening today in the spaces of the dying and the grieving is the most updated, right? It's the most current. And so we need to stay current by gathering together, sharing our experiences with each other, sharing what we have learned. And this is one of the intentions that, brought us here tonight. So I think, oh, let me see what else. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share with you, I put together some slides for you so that hopefully, it just looks pretty and all that. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. And then, Doug and I will converse a little bit, and as things come up for you, if you have questions or comments, please share in the chat. This is a very informal community space. But because we don't have Q&A or anything, so in the chat, if you have a question, if you could preface whatever you write when it's a question with the word question, so it's easier for us to find it in the chat, okay? And so we'll do our best. And if we stay a small group, then maybe, we can open up the question and answer portion, but we'll see, ¿vale? So we ready to get started? Okay. All right, so I am going to share my little slideshow. Okay, so this is something that I've put together to try to land what we have learned from Elisabeth so far, and also recognizing that this is something that is not only evolving constantly, but that also it's going to be a living framework in each of you as you maybe recognize some of these things in your own experience or in your own conceptualizing of what it is that calls you to this service and so on. And so just so you have an idea, I came up with some layers and practice based on what I observed that Elisabeth did or whatever she shared in her lectures. There's an amazing YouTube channel, if you're ever curious, with a lot of digitized interviews and classes that she gave that is really wonderful if you want to get a real sense of the woman. And so a few things that I observed. So one is that there is something that calls us to this space, right? There's something in us that is what allows us also to have a certain level of comfort in the discomfort potentially of being in a space of somebody in their process of dying or somebody in their process of grieving. And so I observed a few, along with some of Ken's help. What were those qualities in the person that sort of makes it easier for us to step into the space? Then what are the foundational sort of postures that one steps into the space with, then what are the things that emerge in the space that we can observe and be witness to that then guide the process of accompanying another? And then what is needed from us for us to be able to be in that space? Okay. So we start with the foundation of the accompanier, and I take the liberty of using that word. I don't even know if it really exists in English, because in Spanish, el acompañante, it's a little bit different than companion, right? And then we have different definitions for what a companion is versus someone who accompanies, okay? And so we're talking about the latter. So from what I've observed, the conditions that make our capacity to accompany possible come from lived experience. Much more than what we can learn in a training, there's something that as we live life and as we meet death in different ways and loss and wounding and all of these things, something starts to take shape. Something is preparing the ground that allows us to be able to sit with the other. And it generally has to do with our own capacity to sit with those things as they happen in our own lives. Then, I mean, and I'll go into it more in a more detailed fashion, but this quality of humility that comes from having lived it and been close to it. So I came up with 6 roots based on what I observed from Elisabeth's life. One is proximity to death. Like in the case of Elisabeth, not almost dying, after birth, then having like a vulnerable childhood because of that, but then also this sort of tendency toward dying things and suffering. Like she always took in all the wounded animals in her farm and different things that then led her to be more curious about the collective deaths in the space after the war. Her walking there, and in the process of walking there, if you know some of that story, maybe you do, her wanting to be of support to those in need and volunteering in places that, according to her father, was actually shameful and not something a young woman should be doing. And so that leads us to recognizing that childhood adverse experiences can be something that is that becomes a strength or gives us the capacity to perceive in a different way and to also be able to connect with the spaces of others who are in different challenges. Then she recognized and was guided by this compassionate impulse that this is something that is not necessarily taught, but something that just is born of the person, this impulse to want to be present, to be supportive of a person through challenges and so on. Number one, that it's not like performative in the sense, it's not because I want to be a better person or be perceived as a good person, but rather because there's just something that guides us to be present with the other. And EKR had a name for this. She called it the animating force, almost like life force, what drives us. So then humility and simplicity as part of what we gain from those first 3, that is the not needing to be the expert. It's the willingness to not know, to not have the answers, to just be there, discover what is there to teach me. Yeah. And so then that also allows for the person who in their process to be the center and be the guiding force of the space. And then in the case of Elisabeth particularly, it's very evident her healthy relationship with no. On the one hand was to refuse what is expected, right? Like whatever the systems say, whatever the story is about, whatever the requirements are, if they don't serve the dying person, then we could say no to that. That on the one hand. And then on the other, how do I respond to when I am being told no, when actually I know it can be yes, right? So in the case of you can go in there with a dying person or whatever, yes, I can, right? So this healthy relationship with no. And then this also you see how all of these things kind of stack one on top of the other, like with one, then the next one comes, the next one comes. This capacity to be with, either be part of or be with those who are at the margins, those who are underserved, those who are ignored by the systems. That there's the dominant culture, and then there's the yes that we bring to those spaces. And all of Elisabeth's life, we can see her as she always went toward those who were least served. And so, this is my justification here, the philosophical foundation of each of these phases, is that formation comes through direct encounter. And, I told you already a little bit about her stories, but that each of these encounters, each of these life experiences, even when and often because they were adverse, are the ones that leave the mark, that becomes the strength and the wisdom that can be in those spaces with humility and simplicity in order to be able to serve others. And so I stopped my share, yes? So we can
Yes.
see each other. And so, Doug, how does this land for you?
No, when I was first looking at what you pulled together with the roots, I thought they were more individual. But as you were talking and as they were stacking, it resonated more with me. And as I navigated, I certainly resonated with the proximity to death. That was my dad's death 10 years ago. And just being in that space and wanting to honor him. And I think honoring him as his son, right? And just being in that space and navigating and preparing and doing everything I thought was right or he would want. But then as you continued on with the six different routes, I connected with compassionate impulse. And I feel like that's part of my personality. And this is certainly back in reflection, right? In reflection, like I said, I first was drawn to, of course, it was proximity, but I think there's this tendency to this impulse, I think is a resonates with me. And then the humility deeply resonates with me. And just certainly in the moment of not knowing, and still today, not knowing everything, right? And just coming out of my sister's death 2 weeks ago, learning again. And I heard a lot of my colleagues say, death is the teacher and the process is the teacher. And so I find myself humbled again 10 years later with my sister's death. And so
Mhm.
certainly resonating. I can see how this creates the formation of how somebody might come in to provide death care through the role of a doula or caretaker.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that so much, that what you just said of like it humbles us yet again,
Yeah.
right? It's like we can never assume we know anything, even when we know some stuff, right? Experience has taught us some things, but every single situation is unique, and every single situation is wanting to teach us something if we are able to set aside any assumptions so that we can actually receive the learning from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
I also find,
yeah.
sorry, I also find the learning, being in INELDA, when we first went online and being in those spaces and groups of 50 or 60 individuals, and not only learning directly from my experience, but learning as other people intimately shared their experience, once again informed me and then further increased my humility of I don't know.
Yeah, and that, I am so grateful that in this day and age, at least within our communities that who are, in these spaces, we can have those opportunities to share. Because, this taboo and this death denial and stuff like doesn't allow us to be talking about these things, which keeps us assuming that whatever we know or don't know is abnormal and not part of the human experience. But when we sit in these spaces, not only are we discovering something new, because every perspective, every situation that we have been present with is going to be teaching us something. We are all teachers for each other with that legacy that we receive from every accompaniment that we ever did. But then we also contextualize ourselves into a truth that out there is denied, right? So yeah, so it's especially wonderful.
Well, and yeah, I'll just share one other thing that's
Hmm.
top of mind when you said that. It's like being in this community of death care, being in my professional, in the organization, amongst friends and family. And it's so raw because it was my sister's funeral just last Wednesday at this time, Wednesday the day. The idea of reflecting on how grateful I am for this community because looking at my siblings who couldn't go say goodbye to my sister, or my stepmother that couldn't go say goodbye to her stepdaughter because of the fear of death. And they've stayed in this space. And I've been so grateful to have a place to share and learn that in that space I was over the past couple of weeks. I think I was much more in relationship with death in the
Hmm.
loss and felt it versus in this denial or I'm not going up there. And even my brother said to me, I can't, you deal with death all day. I can't deal with death. And so once again, I think these experiences, certainly in my short time of 10 years, has really transformed, um, I think the relationship I have and understanding of death.
Hmm.
Yeah, just sharing.
Thank you. Yeah, there's so much that could be, but let's get through
Yes,
the
yes.
slides
I could
and
talk
then,
forever. Yeah.
yeah, I know. Oh, isn't that wonderful? I think we're doing great honor to Elizabeth right now. She's happy. Okay, so what is the underlying posture that the orientation, like how do we enter into this space? What do we um you know it's this between who we are and then what is it that we're going to quote unquote do, right? It's not so much about what we can do, but we'll see. So it's not something that we learn as techniques, even though today we have been able to land certain things that potentially emerge in the space, right? So this is something that we always make emphasis of. It's like I'm not coming in there with a menu of things, but rather because I've observed that these are the kinds of things that emerge in the space, then I'm more aware of the possibility of them emerging in the space, right? And so Elizabeth starts out as she's telling us everything that she's learning from all of the people that she's serving. We start to observe that there are certain things that tend to emerge in the space and that we cultivate this by being in this space, right? Which is another one of those things that it's like, well, if they keep telling us that we can't be with the dying, or if we start to believe that we can't be with death, right? These things that people tell us and we just assume they're the truth, then we're never going to have the opportunity to cultivate our capacity to be with death, right? So the best way is to be cultivated, but it's not just with death, and you'll see what I mean. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but so there are three main axes. It's hard to put names on these things, so I was getting all elaborate. But basically, there's three fundamental things that emerge in the space and the space needs from us. The recognition that death is a natural process, that, EKR shifted that premise that was from like death is a medical failure, like we can't let death happen because it would be a failure, whatever, to recognizing that it is a natural process, that if it were undisturbed, it has its own intelligence and pace, and that it guides us and it guides the dying person. And so that the information that is needed is happening and emerging in the moment as the process is occurring. It's not something we can predict or get prepared for. We just have to be present with it. But at the foundation, we all agree that death is a natural process. And then that the dying person has an autonomy and that it's really about them, right? She started that in her first book, On Death and Dying, where she was like, we need to listen to these people we're supposed to be caring for and seeing what are they saying, how are they feeling, what's working, what's not working, what would they rather, what are their actual needs? We're not tending to any of that. We need to listen to them. And then we need to honor what they say and what they express that are their needs. Then the shift of what healing actually means, right? So in the medical space, the focus is on curing, I guess, right? This healing that has to do with the body, it has to do with, reversing a natural process that's already taking place. And so to shift to understand that there is a healing that dying facilitates, that is not the curing of the body, but something else, right? So as she sat there and observed, healing comes from all of these different needs that show up for the dying person, making sense of their life, attending to unfinished business, having conversations, and finding peace with the life in their own terms. And that's not something that we can guide. This is something that naturally occurs in a dying person. And so this idea that we're not there to cure, that, this is not a medical issue, that this is about the person, right? And then I was able to identify 5 elements in this orientation, which is I'm not there to rescue, save, change anything of what is. I am there to witness, to learn from, as we just shared. And then that I am entering rather than going in there to shift things to fit into a particular model, a particular expectation, and so on and so forth. That when somebody is in their process, they're in their own universe, in their own reality, and that as practitioners, whatever role we are, in, that we are entering into that reality. We are being invited into it. We're not there to change it, to fix it, to blah, 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 but rather to recognize that we're being invited in. And then that slowing down is part of this practice, that as we enter into that reality, something even in that reality starts to slow everything down. It's like the time feels different. Words are not so necessary. Silence sets in more. Communication, if there is any, can happen in many different ways. And this is one of the main, I think, for me, most valuable legacies that Elisabeth left us that we, I think, are now finally ready to fully embrace. Um, and then horizontality, which means that we arrive as equals with that person. We are also human, that we're alongside, that it's not about this hierarchy of, the person who knows and the dying person is the one who doesn't know or whatever. And then not interfering with the process, right? So that what we do is cultivate that space where the dying can unfold in the person's terms, and that the foundation of that is presence. And often she used to say that the form of care is presence. That's what caring is. Okay, and so yeah, so basically I'm just sort of giving you like the foundation of as being present with and observing all of these things. That's how she came to understand these things, and that's how she came to advocate for them. So a little break from slides. Doug?
Um, of course, as you're speaking, I'm also continue to reflect, and just in my lived experience. And the one that resonates most with me is the slowing down. My story has always been is when my dad died. It was always that I'm in the East Coast, so the silence before a snowstorm, right? And you had just said the silence, and
Mm-hmm.
just with um, everything going on, that I could hear the silence after he died. And I also, as my story continues, a year later, my son was born, and we lived in a corner brownstone with, dozens of people walking. He was born 12:32 in the afternoon, so lots of activity. But once again, and that transition of life coming in, there was silence as well, right? This silence with everything happening, the pace and the silence. And it's once again, it's the silence before the snowstorm is how I can only describe it. Really, um, over the years, I think I've leaned into that more and appreciate, you know, because unknowingly when my father was dying too, I've learned the body naturally knows how to die, right? I've learned that. I've learned that through my colleagues. I learned it from education and stories um, but all the sounds his body was making as he was dying, right? And there's a space for that to be allowed and to not interfere, because I think we want to interfere, but holding that space and just letting it be and um, because the ones that are witness to the death, are the ones that are most uncomfortable. I'll share another story. My sister had a cardiac event. Her eyes were open, and my nieces wanted to tape her eyes shut for 3 days. But who is that serving, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was serving the family because we didn't want to look at her that way, right? But really, we didn't do it great, thankfully. But the idea of like it's some of the things that we do and just I feel like that would have been an interference, right? We are here to witness, and that was my sister's dying journey.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if
Yeah,
that's helpful to share, but
yeah, yeah.
it's resonating, and I have lots of being so raw. I've been lots of different tangents of processing, and this is all quite relevant and
Mm-hmm.
actually helping me navigate through.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, it's all very, I mean, I'm so grateful for thinking and feeling all of that is coming up as we are exploring this. Because I have two things pulling me in two directions, so I'm trying to decide which one to go with first. Because that last thing that you just said, again, because we have assumed that we cannot be with death. We assumed that. Somebody told us that story, who knows when, and we just assumed it as the only truth and the only option. This is one of the ways in which we can have a healthy no, to say, actually, where did that even come from? That wasn't my original thought. So let's look at what it is for me. Because when we are with the dying, all of that becomes familiar, even if it takes different forms. It starts to become familiar. So people say, oh no, we fear death because it's so unfamiliar. It's the unknown. Well, it's quite known if you're with it, even if it's never going to be the same. Because when you talked about sounds, I remembered, my mother died 6 months ago. The sounds, I still sometimes, I'm surprised by a memory that has like a scene and the sounds. And there is something that is communicated with those sounds that are not, right now I am intentionally forming sounds that land as words that are communicating something, right? But a dying person, the dying body is making its own language sounds that are not saying any of the things that we could ever think that we know, nor are they coming from the consciousness that is trying to communicate very particular linear messages, but the body is communicating with our body. There are certain things about those sounds that say something. There are certain ways in which the different breath patterns and all these things are inviting that silence and that slowing down, right? And then if we were with death more often, then we would not have this story in our heads that if eyes are open, they should be shut. Right. And I don't mean this in any judgment for the way things are, but the more we are, and I think of a story of a young woman who was the primary caregiver of her mother. And our doulas accompanied them through a year and a half of a metastatic cancer that she did not want to treat. And so the daughter was very connected with the body, very connected with all the changes, and she was very curious about it. She was 22. When she started the journey, she was 21. And she was fresh enough and without enough stories that she wanted just to be with her mom. And she learned so much from that body, right? And then, at the end, she saw what it ended up being. Anyway, so she went to be with her dad in Costa Rica. And then she called me one day being like, Wilka, I am so horrified. I came to accompany my father to a funeral of his best friend. And I don't recognize whatever that is. What is that? She had never been to a funeral before. So she had never seen an open casket of a body that had been treated through, whatever those things are.
Yeah.
And she was horrified. That's what scared her. She's like, what did they do? Like, do they sew it shut or what? Like, that just seems so unnatural. And she's like, the coloring is so weird. Like, because she knew what a dead body looks like. And she was horrified that anyone would bother to like sew a body into something that we assume is what is
Presentable.
palatable.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bueno, shall we continue and then we'll keep
Sure.
the
Sure.
conversation? Okay.
Yes.
All
Yes.
right. Because I'm very curious to see what you all think about what I was able to come up with here. Okay, so let's go move on to what that orientation. So we're looking at these layers, right? So what brings us to the space, what we start to observe that emerges and is needed of us in this space, and then what makes this orientation possible. So there are certain things that emerge from the space that become available to us as the person who is accompanying and holding this space, right? So these practices, I had no idea what else to call them, is the way that we see what is emerging and then the way that we respond based on that. And so these are some of the things that I was able to identify from Elisabeth's, living and sharing with us. So, number one, that this presence and this witnessing is attending to language beyond words, right? One of the things that we often get stuck in, and especially when we're training as doulas, is about, well, what if I don't understand, all these things about thinking. And one of the things that we talk about at INELDA is that we don't need to understand in order to be present with another. And in fact, if we get stuck with trying to understand, we may be missing what's actually there, right? So one of the things that EKR, Elisabeth, demonstrated throughout was that there is so much that is being communicated that is beyond language through different kinds of gestures, through body movements, through the imagery that the dying person may refer to, speak to, suddenly connect with, of things that are around them or that things that are coming up in their own memories or imagination, the way a person is breathing, the way the muscles are contracted or relaxed. There's so much that is available. And then there comes a time in some cases that is observable when the dying person enters into this sort of altered state of consciousness where they start to speak symbolically and they speak of going someplace or returning home or these kinds of things that now we have more, maybe we talk more about than we did when Elisabeth was talking about it. And she was actually one of the first, if not the first, to systematically document everything that she was observing. And we're talking about, she accompanied thousands of people in their dying process, children from like age 2 to age 97. So she was accompanying people also in all over the world because anywhere she traveled, she would go and do service to whoever needed it. And so she was, going to give a lecture here. She would also go and serve there. And so she also did a lot of studies with people from different cultures, different backgrounds, different traditions, different belief systems, and started to observe something that was emerging that was more human, that was more common across cultures. Then she observed the symbolic and pre-death communications that happen very often, if not always, except we are not paying attention. So there is a recurring theme that is, in my experience, always the case. Of course, I haven't been with thousands of dying people, but I've been with enough people to be able to confidently say, yes, this happens always. Is that the person in the process of their dying has visions of people who have already died, that they have imagery of crossing or moving toward, that they leave and come back and then they tell us about it. They have like many near-death experiences in the process of dying, and that she understood that all of that kind of communication was also trying to tell us something. Those of us who stay, those who are holding the space, we are in a particular phase of the process, and that this is not the place to be saying, no, you're not in on a boat right now. You're in whatever. Like, it's not about correcting or interpreting, but just being present with, in the same way that we're present with how somebody's breathing or other things that we see in the space. Then she speaks of the cultivating of the doorway. So she spoke of this doorway as that space that allows for the dying person to fully enter into these spaces of transition as they are nearing their death. That rather than trying to, control it or correct it, or I don't know, tone it down or something, or sedate it, that this was something that needed to be allowed to manifest if it was manifesting. And that what we do is to be present with it. That's how we, quote unquote, create that, through the attention that we pay to that, and let them manifest it in whatever form. So something else that she, oh, I don't know what happened there. There, okay, there was like an echo for a moment. So something that she also observed was this impulse for completing the unfinished, right? So, and there's, we say, oh, people are lingering because something is open or something has not been completed. And we, some of us have been in these spaces, we observe how this is so, and that we now can identify that there are certain elements of a particular person's life that may show up toward the end of their life to be given some kind of attention, because it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be resolved or that it's going to be given closure, but that there's a space that is asked for nearing the end of life. And then we've maybe heard about the permission to let go or the permission to release. This was something that she observed, not so much that anyone is there to say, you have my permission, now you can go, right? It's not so much that, but rather that there's something that happens in the space that then, as the dying person is coming to terms with what is happening, as the people around them are coming to terms with what is happening, there is something that allows for that release. Sometimes it is words that need to be said. Sometimes it is literally, you can go, I'm going to be okay. But also, sometimes it's for the people who are who are dying, to need to let the others know, I'm going to be okay and you're going to be okay. So whatever that is, it was something that she observed that was showing up, and that seemed to be one of the things that the space required. Then there's that, of course, the accompaniment is not just about the person dying, that it's also for the family and the friends and everyone else who's there. And we see that evident in the subtitle of the first book she published on death and dying. Then, of course, we observe that there's a life review that happens not just in the dying person, but also in the people who are holding space for the dying, that people start to think about the life they lived, the memories they shared, what they feel kind of not so great about, what they really are grateful for, and that this is part of what death activates, and this is something I love to play with in Spanish. It works better than in English, which is that active dying, which in Spanish is muerte activa, activates. La muerte activa. So, it's a little game for those of you who understand Spanish, that there's something about the dying process that activates something in everyone, including obviously the person in the process of their dying. And then the other practice is that capacity of sustained presence during the active dying process, with everything else that we've already talked about, without having to fill the space with anything or intervene in any way or distract from what is actually occurring. And this was something that she did, that somehow she found time to do a lot with a lot of people. And so again, she observed and was very curious about what a patient said, how they said it, what they reached for, what they felt was needed, what images came to them, what they kept, referring to or turning back to, or, to, that maybe wasn't even a story, but something even in the space that allowed for a particular kind of contemplation or other things. And that this symbolic language was something that often, or maybe always, emerged because words don't serve that last part of the process, which is I think, really fascinating because we are often so concerned about what we are supposed to say. And what Elisabeth is saying is just be present, just observe everything. Let that be the guide. So, Douglas.
Well, I think Elizabeth would be proud to see how you've grouped them in these eight, and just think it's helpful um, for individuals that are, coming into this death care space to know that these exist, right? That these are, as you call them, practices, and to embrace them all, right? And to really understand, because had I known those eight, in this case, existed going with my father, I think I would have been much more open, right? I think it would have been a much different experience. My dad's death was diagnosed in February, gave him 12 months to 18 months, and died 3 months later, February, March, he died in April. So I had the privilege of being in a medical system where it was the curing, right? We're going to cure him, we're going to cure him of his cancer, and then died. And so I spent all the time not being present, but on this kind of medical, going to cure, we're going to intervene wheel. Fast forward to my mother-in-law's death, who my husband made the choice after the open heart surgery, they couldn't do anything, to bring her home and to be much more present. Of course, that was 5 years later, and I knew more about these practices or understanding, right? And embracing them, and the noises the body was making, and all the death rattles we call, all those things were natural, and to be at I'm going to use the word peace, and be able to explain to my partner she's an active dying now. And so bringing our son to say goodbye, and so much more, I use the word relationship again, being in relationship with death, and understanding these eight practices existed, and being with my mother-in-law, and being there, and giving and having choices to be present or not present, meaning my partner to stay that night or not stay. It's really um, grateful, certainly for Elizabeth's work and the ground she laid, and then grateful for your, you know, putting this together, and what I even call digestible, right? What is understandable as as somebody that might be new in this space to navigate, and certainly critical and essential for doulas to honor all eight of these.
Yeah, and it has been like a really interesting process to try to extract certain observations into something that I could put into a box, kind of, But as I was doing that, and I mean, I even at this moment, I worked on this for a while, and I still question all of the words I use to try to describe these things because I was trying to be a little not provocative is not the right word, but just to like, a practice actually is asking you to do nothing. Like that was part of the play that I was making with that because there's really not a I don't know what the right term is, right? Like the approach, like, with INELDA, we came up with like the approach, right? Because it's not so much about what we're there to do, but there's so much that is going on, and there's so much that can be observed. And anyway, so it's been interesting because also I think about, Elisabeth was too busy just, being out there and like listening to the dying people and everything to actually come up with like, oh, look, this is the method or what have you, right? But then everything that we today have been able to land, like I said at the beginning, is because some of us were able to sit down and say, okay, so how do we land this into something that we can share in a way that actually resonates with other people's experience, right? We're not telling people it's like this, but rather, we're trying to like make it like this. Does that make sense to you? You know?
That's
So how do we find ourselves in that map? It has been very interesting as I was doing that. And then, of course, I'm so intimate with the INELDA doula approach, and then sort of observing how we naturally came to similar places based on the fact that we have been in those spaces. So then that talks to me about this collective wisdom or this nature, this instinct that we carry, that some of us, who have moved through all those routes that I made up there, um, can then or want to make that be how we live. Okay, so I'm gonna keep going and then maybe we can have some time to chat together. Oh, I got clicked on the wrong thing here. Okay, so then, how do we sustain this capacity? So as the person who is accompanying, there is an ongoing cultivation. And this is my favorite part. Well, it isn't. I mean, I love everything about it, but what's my favorite about it is this, that I have discovered that those of us who are in these spaces, like everybody who's here right now, who keep feeling that impulse, that guiding, that force that is guiding us, and that we keep wanting to learn more, and because it's becoming current, or actualizing its, I don't know, that's not the word in Spanish, it's actualizar, updating itself on a regular basis with every death that we can be with every way in which we're accompanying others. We are getting updated to the most current truth about what dying is and what accompaniment is. We sustain this capacity, which then leads us to be cultivating better quality humans. And to me, that is revolutionary because we are not just contributing to better dying, we are contributing to better living and, putting aside better, worse, I'm using language that does not do it justice because this is about being more fully human together, right? This recognition that we are also existing in community, that death activates all of us. I could go on. Okay, so how does the practitioner tend their own capacity, right? So we talked about how we learn through the experiences that we live through. The accompanying requires this ongoing self-reflection, having a community, recognizing that there is a community of support, and that we give attention to our own inner experience. So here are some elements. And again, I am questioning all of the language that I used here, but it doesn't matter. So, self-examination was something that Elisabeth was really obsessed with. She understood that we needed to, in community, come together and externalize everything that is emerging as we are facing our own losses, our own changes, our own transitions, our own grief, and then whatever death activated in us, right? So she made these life, death, and transition workshops where 50 people got together and then they would be working on this externalization process and connecting with what is their unfinished business. Because she said that the main thing that gets in our way is our unfinished business. So how do we tend to that? How do we connect with that? Well, letting death activate that. We're gonna just like, it's all gonna emerge. We're gonna have the whole curriculum of growth for the rest of our lives when we are close to death because it reflects it back to us. So we can then tend to it, right? But we don't do this in the space of the dying person. But when we have this active relationship with death and dying, then we could do it anytime. And we can cultivate it all the time, and we can recognize the small deaths that bring up the unfinished business. So then we tend to, right? And then we rely on this community as the structure that sustains us, recognizing that each of us is having all of this going on, right? That each of us is going through losses, we're having our changes, we're having our transitions, we have the unfinished business coming up, and that we are being responsible to tend to it. And then the community can just support that, not having expectations. And then guess what starts to happen? We are accompanying each other, right? So I was thinking as I was putting this together that we are relational beings as a species, as humans. And now I'm starting to think the foundation of relational being is accompanying each other, right? The community accompanies the individuals accompany each other in community, and we don't need to change anything. We can allow silence, we can let them, the symbolic language manifest. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like it's a model that exists in the micro and in the macro. So you see why I think this is like revolutionary for the evolution of humanity. And then that we need to process after each encounter, because even when we have been cultivating our capacities, when we go into the space of the dying, we're always also going to encounter something we didn't know. And that is going to awaken something else in us that then we bring joyfully to our community so that we can say, hey, there's this thing that I haven't processed that maybe if we process together, then we can make sense of it. And then we all can learn something together from me having been in the trenches of it and coming back to report and share. So that, and then there's an interesting, I don't even know if it's like it's two different things, but they are more connected from the lens of the way Elisabeth dealt with it, which wasn't so much that there was like a self-care practice out there, but that this cultivation was what allowed for that capacity to feel prepared, not because we're prepared with our minds, but because we feel like we have been uh, tending to the unfinished business on a regular basis, right? So then that is what the self-care is. That is what the self-preparation is so that we can hold the space for others, right? We can be resourced because we don't have unattended stuff that's going to come up. And so from that lens, which I think is a very interesting perspective, then if we are tending to our own unfinished business on a regular basis, connecting with our community, externalizing whatever is coming up, processing it, all of these different things, then we would not be burnt out. And I say this with care. I am not negating the reality of burnout. And at the same time, I think the argument was if you are like a clean slate on a regular basis and you're showing up fully resourced because you don't have all this baggage, then you're only there to receive all of the learning and all of the guiding, and you're not doing anything more than being present. It is sort of self-sustaining. It's like it gives back. It allows you to be, to continue to be present. But we still have much to get there, but some of these elements can support that. And then that the continued formation or training actually happens as we deepen the relationship with death, grief, and loss through reflection, through community, and that this is something that we get quote unquote better at, more familiar with over time. That this is not something that we can just like cram a book and then we are perfect accompaniers tomorrow. It's something that we need to live through. And so, just as a little wrapping it up of that, those life, death, and transition workshops started as that space that holds all of these different things so that people could then, show up and be present. And, so that then it allows us to be able to like face our own dying when our time comes. Okay, so what does that bring up?
I mean, for me, as I've said several times, I'm living all six of them. Like I can see them, and they're not in any order. Like number three is where I am tonight. I'm in community, right? In a week or two or another month, I might be more in the formation or deeper learning. But I think I started tonight with being grateful to be here, and I think this is part of my healing and my
Mhm,
self-awareness and self-preparation. And when I look at INELDA's doula approach is the awareness, the autonomy, the dying process. And we spend a lot of time in the principle one, which is the self-awareness, right? We don't spend a lot of time in the business or developing a business. Is really how do you show up? How do you
mhm,
show up? And I always say I can't show up if I haven't done my own work, and I can't. I'm not tending to my father, right? I'm processing that loss, or I'm not tending to my sister now, but I have to process that so I can be a better companion, or I can accompany, or be a better doula. So I'm in all the elements. I think you called them elements. I'm in all of them. They're kind of, and they're not linear, and they're swirling. Even when you were talking earlier with the hands, right? Like even our former model was like linear. None of this is linear, right? It's not linear, and I'm leaning into the fluidity of it and the
mhm.
experience of it.
Yeah, and I think that first thing that we talked about that I called the roots at the time,
Yeah.
which is all of these things that sort of make us fertile for being able to be or feel called to be present with others. I just lost my train of thought trying to look for a word, but you were just saying, I just lost my train of thought. Um,
They weren't linear, they were moving like
oh
one.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, is what allows us to be able to be humble enough and simple enough to recognize that nothing is linear, that it is not about rational thinking or like thought process or language. And for us to allow ourselves to be sort of moved around depending on what death is activating in that moment, right? And to recognize that I'm here now and then I'm here and these two things are related all of a sudden and then they're not and then, right? So I think, yeah, it makes us more prepared for life. This is the thing that also is so evident. It's like when we're talking about death, it prepares us for better living too. Or I don't like to use those words like better, so I
No,
apologize.
but I understand what you're saying because even I always say, having trained and having been in this space, I feel like I'm a better son, partner, father, right? Because the self-awareness is extended beyond my time in death or supporting somebody in death. It's that formation, right? So that formation now is with me. It's in me.
Mhm.
It's in my approach to life. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just want to share a few more things and then we can maybe even have a little conversation since there's a small group. So, I just have to name this very quickly that, Elizabeth's larger, broader contribution is everything that is not the five stages. Like this was sort of like this bizarre distilling, flattening down of something that is way greater. But on top of that, there's so much more material out there that if you're curious about, on children and death, on the symbolic language, on like death as the final stage of growth, on like all of the near-death experience studies that she did and everything that she discovered and that was very clinically registered and all of this other stuff. It's like a whole world that we can discover about her. And that you can look more about this too. That the five stages is just this thing that was easy to like, make into popular culture and simplifies things, but that she never intended it to be the way that it is today. And even before she died, she was like, really? Are people still talking about the freaking five stages? Like that wasn't even the point, you know? So it's interesting to think about like also like what happens. I mean, I can think of a lot of things that happen historically that then were narrowed down into some like very flattened one-dimensional thing. But in any case, the main thing that she contributes is that she understood that death is the final stage of growth, that for final in the sense that this is the final stage that the consciousness has in a body. She understood this because of everything she observed. She was never like a believer, like she wanted to like build some fantasy to make you want to believe in it. She was saying it from everything that the dying were telling her, everything she saw happen there, and that from a psychological, psychiatric point of view, it was one more process that allowed for a greater integration in the psyche, that it is a necessary part of the process for a fulfillment of a lifelong experience of, what happens to the development of consciousness. So she understood it in this way. And she learned it through listening to others. And everything that we are doing today ultimately grew from that first act of wanting to just listen and learn. Right. And so I think that is to me the greatest takeaway and this is also the thing that I recognize in myself, that my curiosity and willingness to learn from the experience is what has allowed me whatever I've been able to contribute to the movement. And then, again, this is all things that she experienced, that there was something she observed across cultures that was similar, that was like the one thing that was consistent. And that there's something that she also observed that many people don't talk about in terms of dying today in the death care space, is that, we talk about all these things that we need to expect that are going to be horrible, but there are all these things that also happen in the space of dying that are not being told or spoken a lot enough about the peace that comes in, the lightness that comes in, the shedding of the fear that happens, and this sense of ever-present unconditional love that people can feel, and that there is a moment, whether it's like 6 months before or 6 hours before or 6 minutes before, there is a moment when there is a piece or something else that seems to be evident there that we are missing because we're only thinking about, recording the time of death or whatever the situation may be, right? And so this is part of her message. And, she observed that death was the letting go of just a part that is not the whole. And she likened it to when you finally put away the winter coat because spring is coming. And then finally, I want to say that, she was by far the most rigorous investigator. And of course, her research methods were everything from like the most scientific to more empirical to a combination of, phenomenological approaches that I don't know if she was even aware of, like all of these things that today we can say are particularly valid ways of doing research. But she was like the most rigorous researcher. And while back then, she got to the point in her research where she's like, oh, well, actually, death doesn't exist, which I think is a little bit of a haiku too. I always sit with this statement. What does that mean? Death does not exist. And then until the point that I'm not thinking about what it means, and then other things happen. But that she actually felt like everybody should know this. Like, what is wrong with this, this picture, right? But in any case, nowadays, there's a lot of stuff that's circulating out there, right? Without all the clinical research context that she was operating in, which is, I think, is very interesting because she was a woman, she was a small woman, physically small, and because she was talking about things that back then were needed to be kept separate, right? And I've been asking myself this question, when did we decide to separate something that is so intrinsic to human experience as something that, belongs in weird space, like spaces of esoteric things or spiritual things or religious things or I don't know what. But in any case, because of my own formation as a transpersonal psychologist and the approach that I take with most things, I recognize her approach as very valid research. I mean, apart from being totally clinical, but also from a transpersonal lens, which is not spiritual and it's not, it doesn't go against anything else. It doesn't go for anything else. It just makes room for that natural dimension of human experience that is consistent across cultures. And that is my personal sort of advocation, I don't know if that's a word, for bringing back all of the contributions that she shared. And so I thank you for that attention. And then let's go back to our conversation. Because did I tell you that she was like discredited for talking about these things? Did I already say that? I can't remember. Yeah, right? So like, no, but I didn't tell you this, did I? That On Death and Dying had a 13th chapter that everybody told her to take out. So when she did all of those seminars and she was sitting with dying people and they were, doing all this research with the medical students in the Chicago University Hospital, a big part of the findings from that first round in 1967 to 1969 or 1965 to 67, there was a lot of evidence of dying and coming back, of all of the visions, all of these things that we, assume are like, belong to the people who wish to believe something that doesn't exist. And all of her colleagues and the editorial, everybody said, get that out of that book or you will never be taken seriously. That was in 1969. So from the very beginning, she was observing that from a very curious clinical standpoint. She did not come in there being like, oh, I want to believe there's an afterlife. None of that. She didn't look for that. It just was there, right? So eventually she said, screw it. I'm coming out with it because I can't keep it in any longer. And of course, everybody came after her and tried to say, oh, she's crazy, she's been brainwashed, who knows, what have you. Which is why I said to Ken, 8 years ago, I think we might be ready now. But today, I think, 8 years after I said that, I think we might be ready now.
I hope we're ready.
I hope so too. So, anything else you want to add, Doug? I mean, at
No,
this point,
I think we can take questions if possible. I don't
yeah.
know if open up. Yeah, I just the curiosity. It's just when we approach this care, it's the curiosity. When you just said the curiosity, it's like it just resonated deeply. We show up with curiosity.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I think we're a small enough group. If anyone wants to unmute and share, like either something that's come up as you've been listening to this, or if you have any question.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, what I was thinking about her life is I think this is more of a personal question. She was definitely expanding the field of end of life, but she was such a brilliant person. And I wonder if she was alive today, do we think that she will still be doing end of life or she might have expanded to something else? Because it almost feels to me that her focus was never that alone. I don't know, someone so brilliant that can manage so many different fields and science and human understanding. I'm curious if she was alive today, where her brain would be working at, her heart, everything.
Yeah, before we started this session, we were getting ready and we were talking about how she used to refer to divine manipulation, is what she ended up calling it. And when I started on this journey and I was not privy to that information, I used to feel divinely harassed. That's what I would call it. It's like divine harassment. Like there's something that just will not stop. And now, and Ken is the one who encouraged me to say such a thing, is that I'm convinced that it was her who's harassing me and many others. I'm not the only one she harasses because the work was not finished, right? So if I think about what would she be doing today? She's doing it, by the way. She's doing it through us, right? And I feel this is just the way it is with life and death. And it just something keeps living through us so that whatever is meant to be achieved for our humanity can get a little further ahead. Yes. But she was all over doing everything. She was able to write so much while giving these incredible lectures, serving people constantly. And she also had a farm. And she tended to all manner of animals and gardens. And when she did those life, death, and transition workshops, she was cooking the meals for 50 people, facilitating the training, participating in the training, training others so that they could train, writing her books, whatever, you know, somehow she, to me, she was a living proof that time does not exist and that we live in this mental limitation about what is possible with a lifetime or with a day or with an hour, right? So, for example, one of the things that she was most proud of was all of the work of advocacy and support, direct support with when the AIDS crisis, right? For example. And she was not going to give up, except her house was burnt down twice because she wanted to do a hospice for babies with AIDS. And then she started having strokes because her body just couldn't take it anymore. I mean, that's crazy. Like she lived like nothing happened, and people were in Virginia shooting into her house windows. Right? She lived with like literal death threats. And she just kept being like, nope, I'm making this happen, right? So I could imagine that, she died in 2004. So we're talking about what, a little over 20 years, 30 years? I don't know. I'm confused. Yeah, 20 something years, yeah. She would still be at the edge of whatever is saying no, that she's like, this is possible and I'm gonna make it happen. So I think she would still be within the death field. There's plenty of work to go around for the next couple centuries anyway. And she'd still be cooking for 50 people and, making preserves and like knitting from the wool of her alpaca, whatever's. Yeah, that's what I think.
I had a question for both you and Doug. Wilka, is knowing what you know and coming through with carrying this legacy also and building forward, what is your hope and like your dream of what the world looks like in this area, in our caring for communities and each other?
Doug, you go first.
Yeah, no, the first thing that came to my mind, Mina, just resonates a little bit with what Wilka you were saying a little while ago. Like we're doing her work still, right? Like it's still happening and we're still carrying it forward. And so my hope in participating and being community is that we continue the dialogue and conversations, and we create more spaces, and we also are I don't know the right words to use, but we are open enough and approachable enough for others to come in with curiosity or even fear, right? And going back to my comment earlier with my family, three of my family members couldn't go to the funeral, right? Because, oh, Doug, you know how we are with death, right? And so how can we create a community? And I went in honor of them, and I might have shared this story, 3 hours talking to my mother who wouldn't go. And so maybe in that space, right, my mother will go to the next funeral, or my mother's processing. And so I think my hope is that we keep holding space for each other and accompanying each other. But I want it to be approachable. There's something about the approachability, right? Like, and whatever brings somebody in, because some people are more comfortable, but just to be, um, I feel like open arms. My arms are open, so maybe that we're open and we keep having that dialogue and we learn. I think that's my initial response. Not sure if I answered the question exactly, but that was going through.
Yeah, I think that, híjoles, it's a lofty, for me, my motivation and the thing that activating force, um, I feel like probably the labor will continue beyond my lifetime, is to return that right that we all have to accompany and be accompanied to all people. As we just did a similar session in Spanish with Viviana of El Faro in Argentina. So, I wanted to invite the people who, to me, are at the forefront of this movement from its inception, well, from its conceptual inception of today, of what we know today, right? And I'm gonna borrow a little bit of her words if I can remember, because I went on a tangent again. In a way, to obliterate the need for training for something that is actually our nature.
Yes.
So, we'll do what we can. Anything else that we want to share? Anyone else wants to say anything before we close?
Yeah, I have a question. First off, I just wanted to say thank you so much for all of this. This has been so lovely and so cool to learn about Elizabeth's just her internal like mission, and how she like treated life and how she applied her beliefs and values to everything she did. She sounds like a phenomenal human being. I'm pretty new to this whole world. And I mean, I appreciated what you said at the beginning, Wilka, where you said that, you've been on this journey long before you realized you were on this journey. I'm very recently like realizing where, yeah, like what this is going to look like for me. But my question is, if either of you or really anyone who's here in this Zoom room that does this work has kind of like a personal like almost like mission statement, like your like why, like especially like when things do get like really hard, or you're dealing with like the parts of your day that yeah, when you're just like having a harder day, and like your North Star that you kind of tether yourself to remind you of like your why. I'm super curious.
Mm.
Mm.
I can go. Is that okay? Or do you ready?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
No, you go. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so this is the thing. Um, you know how those first sort of qualities that sort of cultivate the soil where this can be activated and so on and so forth. My motivation, I think, as a human who fits all of those, adverse experiences and all of that. I very early on in my life, I was like, well, if I didn't die, there must be something I can do. Even when I wanted to die, if I didn't die, then I'm stuck here. So what can I do? And so my life became all about what can I do, because living in itself just didn't, there's something felt wrong about it. But somehow that led me somewhere else, that led me somewhere else. And today, when I'm not feeling so hot and I'm like, oh, what died? Something died. Something in me died, something around me died. So what do I have to learn from that? So, what I've learned from the space of the dying now comes into my everyday. And instead of feeling like, ugh, I'm still here, what do I do? It's more like, ooh, something isn't here now. So how is that inviting me to adapt and to grow and to learn? But I learned that, or that first came to like a tangible reality for me when I was with the dying, right? So I don't know, it just for me it's become like everything. It's the only thing that gives meaning to my life. So even the worst thing is a death, and therefore it brings meaning to my life, and therefore it's awesome. That's to the point that I'm at. I don't know if that answers your question. Doug?
Well, I mean, my mantra has been, and I've been in, I'll say professional therapy for 25 years, right? And just through bioenergetics and As you're asking the question, that my mantra is make space, make space. Like when something like my sister's death, make space for it, right? Having a hard day, having a hard conversation, I keep going, just make space for it. And that's as far as I get with like that I can share. I just have to make space, whatever that space is for it. Make space for the loss, make space for the joy, make space. But I think if I was writing a mantra today, it would be make space, make
Mm.
space.
Well, the other thing for
Thank
me that is like the mantra for me, if there is such a thing. So, because the other thing is that in my early life, the deaths that I survived, I mean, and this is another thing I just came up with. We have 4 minutes, so I don't want to take up your time. But I realized that actually death is what happens to us who are still here when the body of somebody else disappears. The form that we recognized dissolves, right? So that actually, I mean, that's me thinking about when Elisabeth said death does not exist. It takes me into these very interesting sort of rabbit holes. So again, I lost my train of thought, but my
You-
mantra
you-
came from my friend who died in a freak accident and then came to see me. And a book by Elisabeth and a story of Mrs. Schwartz, if you find it, was what allowed me to realize that I wasn't going crazy. And this was when I was a teenager. Because my friend came to me. Not only did he come to me, but we hung out, we touched, not, it wasn't sexual. We hugged and all these kinds of things. And we worked together, even though his body had been buried before, right? So what he said to me before we actually were able to hold hands was, Wilka, you don't have to believe anything. Stop believing everything and anything is possible. So that's my only mantra. I don't believe in anything. And then that frees me for whatever.
Beautiful.
Yes. Okay, so we are down to the minute and a half, more or less. Thank you for sharing this time with us.
Thank you.
And we have recorded it for the people who registered who aren't here, and we will share it with everyone.